All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Judge Jones, Whatcom County Superior Court. This is a meeting of a pretrial processes work group. We're a subcommittee of the Incarceration Reduction and Prevention Task Force. Um, Thanks for making time, everyone, this afternoon. We have a few, I think, important things to discuss today. So on the agenda, we have two things. First is Dr. Hamilton, who's with us, who has authored a validation study regarding the Superior Court's use of the PSA. The PSA, I know, was developed out of this group back in 2019. So Dr. Hamilton's done some important work over the last several year or so regarding the use of that PSA and has drawn some conclusions about the court's use of it. So we're going to discuss that today. Thanks for being here, Dr. Hamilton. And then if we have time after that discussion, I know Alan has put together some information about kind of pretrial services in general and some discussion about the operation of his department within Superior Court and how that's going. So that will be a discussion if we have time for that today. Anything from anyone before I invite Dr.
I,
Hamilton? Or
I just wanted to also say if we don't have time, I think Jill sent out the PowerPoint anyways of kind of what we've been doing over the last few months, several months. So that's out there for everybody to see anyways.
Okay. And was everyone here able to get a copy of the validation study, Dr. Hamilton's work, ahead of time before today? Everybody have that? Great, great. I see a bunch of head nods. Okay, so Dr. Hamilton, thanks again for making yourself available. And what I'm hopeful you can do is just kind of walk us through the work that you did, the conclusions that you've drawn, and some of the recommendations that I think are going to be important for us. So,
Sure. I did have some slides. Is that what you wanted me to do? Is present a slideshow? Okay.
yes, please.
I'm gonna share them now if I can. Okay. I'm gonna put it in slideshow mode, but please tell me if it's too small on your screen. Is that okay or is it too small?
It looks good to me.
Okay. My screen is large, so it sometimes has two black bars on either side. I don't know if it's doing that. But let me know and I can take it out of slideshow mode if that helps. Okay, so I'm Zach Hamilton. Excuse me. I'm a professor of criminology and criminal justice, University of Nebraska, Omaha. Formerly, I was a professor at Washington State University. I've been creating, developing, evaluating risk needs assessments for several years. And I did this work in conjunction with one of my graduate students as part of our corrections research lab. What I wanted to walk through today was somewhat of a brief presentation, about 15-20 minutes. Essentially, what I'm going to do is provide you a background about risk and needs assessments and really what goes into them and why they're created and how they're created. And then we're going to give you some background regarding how we assess the predictive performance of risk needs assessments, going through elements of what's called discrimination, calibration, and then we look at bias and overclassification of your tool. And I'll go into greater detail on those things when I get there. Then I'll give you the results of the evaluation, try to put that into sort of a nice, neat box. Although if at any point you find something confusing or needs more clarity, just please open up your mic and just have me stop and re-explain something. I'll then give you some conclusions and recommendations that we've also put in the report as well. So with regards to the background around why people utilize pretrial risk assessments, the pretrial systems generally across the United States have a heavy reliance on cash bail. And a lot of people have noticed, especially sort of the overwhelming use of cash bail, that even things like the American Bail Association lobby is really a for-profit bail industry that's this whole process of creating cash bail has really created significant racial and ethnic biases around or disparities around releases of individuals pre-trial. And so jurisdictions like your own have been increasingly adopting pre-trial risk assessments to help make those decisions. What we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is that those jurisdictions that do adopt pretrial assessments tend to see them as an evidence-based strategy and are able to reduce detention and bail through their use. A lot of these tools are built around some correctional principles. In particular, the risk-need responsivity model. This was built by a researcher back in 1990. His name was Don Andrews. He essentially said that there's three elements that you want to look at when you're releasing or supervising somebody in the community. You want to assess their risk to identify how much supervision they need. This assessment can be made up of, criminal history indicators or dynamic indicators about their life. They'll be static or dynamic. Then you might want to examine what sort of programs or interventions they need while they're in the community to help them, stay crime-free. Those are typically dynamic indicators that can be changed over time. And then you want to look at their responsivity. Really, what is the effectiveness of that supervision or that intervention for that individual? Are they going to have barriers that are going to prevent them from working within the normal sphere of what you would consider supervision or release in the community? A lot of these principles have been applied within the development of risk needs assessments, which are usually shortened to RNA. RNAs have been utilized and demonstrated as an effective evidence-based practice for the last 40 years, that they've sort of been used within the correctional sphere. The principles of why they're used is really to create a standardization across your jurisdiction so that individuals, regardless of who's being seen, who's being assessed, they get judged for their level of risk similarly across that jurisdiction. Assessments themselves are really the foundations of those R&R practices, and essentially what they do is they classify and they rank individuals typically into categories of low, moderate, and high. And these tools, again, they create that standardization so that you can perceive that an individual that's identified as high risk, it shouldn't matter whether or not they're male or female or what their race or ethnicity is or who's doing the assessment or who's being assessed. That it should provide the same sort of outcome in terms of who should be released and what sort of effective interventions and case management you should have. Essentially, an assessment boils down to a composite score or a system of scales which combine items or questions that you ask of an individual that are then scored or given values. And after you collect enough scores, it really forms a nice normal distribution or a bell curve in which higher scores are identified to have a greater outcome, a greater likelihood of a particular outcome that you're trying to prevent. With regards to these tools, they started with post-conviction samples, i.e. parole and probation, but after finding the utility in a lot of different justice outcomes, they were expanded to predict things like failure to appear for pretrial populations, technical violations in the community, as well as infractions within prisons. As far as pretrial assessments go, they're typically used to make that decision or to guide that decision on pretrial detention, whether or not you release somebody, ROR, conditional release, or whether or not they're recommended to be detained. One of the first tools that was created was the Virginia Pretrial Risk Assessment Instrument, the VPRAI. It's not used as frequently as often now, but it was pretty prolific for the last 10 or 15 years. One of the other tools that's been developed is called the Ohio Risk Assessment System, or the ORAS, in which they have a small subset of their tool that's called the Pretrial Assessment Tool, or the PAT. Between those two and the PSA, that's pretty much the totality of tools that are used within the United States. With regards to how tools are created, I find it's helpful to identify the pieces that go into it so that you know how your tool was created as well and how it might differ from some other tools and how they're adopted. Typically, the way a tool is created is a researcher or a developer of a tool will create a potential list of all predictor items. So if you're trying to predict recidivism or you're trying to predict failure to appear, you'll establish a pool of everything under the sun that might predict. You'll then administer or ask those questions to your population or any sort of justice-involved individuals, and then you follow them over time and track to see who reoffends or who commits those particular outcomes. After you gather all that data back in, you then adjust the items, removing anything that doesn't predict and maybe changing the values of things that have stronger or lesser predictive value. Then you set cut points. Usually that's determined based on policy or resources to identify who's low, moderate, and high risk. And finally, you end up validating the tool to see whether or not it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and that's really why we're here today. So in terms of how we go about assessing predictive performance of a tool or how you go about validating a tool, One of the primary ways that you go about validating a tool is utilizing one particular statistic that's pretty common. It's called the area under the curve statistic. I teach statistics for a living. I promise I'm not going to make this an entire statistics lecture, but I will do some key indicators here. The area under the curve statistic essentially tries to combine or create a composite of four really important predictions that happen within a risk assessment tool. They're called false positives, false negatives, true positives, and true negatives. So if I were to say that you're high risk and you end up committing a new offense, that's a true positive, meaning you're high risk and you committed an offense. If I would say that you're low risk and you don't commit an offense, that would be a true negative, meaning that I was right on the low end of the scale. If I were to say that you're high risk and you don't commit the new offense, then that would be a false positive. And if I were to say you're low risk and you do commit an offense, that would be a false negative. So it's two potential accurate responses and two potential inaccurate responses, all balanced together into what's called the area under the curve statistics, summarizing all of those different potential outcomes. The area under the curve statistic ranges from 0.5 all the way up to 0.1, which is perfect prediction. 0.5 is essentially tantamount to flipping a coin. Heads, I think you're high risk and you're going to recidivate. Tails, I think you're low risk and you won't. It's essentially a random chance. Most risk needs assessment tools fall within the middle sixes, indicating moderate predictive strength. Anything above 7 are usually those tools in which somebody's taken some care to really develop it and redevelop it through multiple versions within a given jurisdiction. Those tend to get into that stronger accuracy level. I've put a table there to the right that indicates the strength, where anything between that coin flip and 0.55 is considered negligible strength, meaning you might as well be flipping a coin. Anything 5.6 to 6.3 is considered weak, meaning you're getting something out of it, but not a lot. Anything 6.4 to 7.0 is considered moderate. And recently, the Council of State Governments identified that tools that make it into that moderate range or above are considered acceptable to be used across US standards. Then anything above 7.1 is considered strong. And those are really
I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi. I see Stephen leaning forward, much like I am, trying to make it bigger. Is there a way to
Oh, sure.
at all?
I
That
think
would
it's my screen. Is that better? I can take it out of slideshow mode.
way better. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry about that. That's been happening recently with my screen. I apologize. Okay. So do I need to recap anything that was hard to understand? Okay. All right. So essentially, we're looking for anything 6.4 and above is considered acceptable by those national standards. There is some detail that I want to describe a little bit more about how risk scores work, though. So I've really created a figure here to help explain it a little bit in terms of some of the other things that we look for within a risk assessment beyond the AUC. So if I had a hypothetical risk score that ranged from 0 to 100, and you can see the risk score there at the bottom of that figure, ranging from 0 to 100, you could score on that tool. And then on the vertical axis, you can see their reoffending probability ranging from 0 to 100%. What you see in that blue line is sort of what you want to see, which is a 45-degree angle tilt, which means that as risk scores increase, your offending probability or your reoffending probability increases in tandem. That dotted green line in the middle essentially indicates the distinction between higher versus lower risk. And what you'd like to see is that if somebody scored a value of 60 on that tool, that they might have a higher probability of recidivism, maybe 55, 60% based on this scale, as compared to somebody that scored lower, a 40% recidivism probability. And so that distinction or the tilt of that line really has an impact of how well that tool is working and whether or not it's meaningful for your population. If you had this tool, you might have, a really strong area under the curve statistic of maybe 7.5. But an area under the curve statistic doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting that substantial effective tilt to your line. You could have a less accurate tool that might have a flatter slope to it. Essentially, a score of 60 still means that you have a higher reoffending rate than a score of 40, but the distinction between their reoffending probability is not all that different because that plane is so flat, meaning that that tool really isn't good at separating individuals by their likelihood of offending. Even though they're slightly higher scoring 60 and slightly lower scoring 40, you can still get a high AUC. It just doesn't mean that the tool's functioning all that well or is calibrated really well for your population. So we like to look at a lot of different things, not just the AUC, which is really what people tend to harp on in terms of national standards. What we also like to look at is really calibration. And what calibration means is my tool might tell you that you have a 60% probability of reoffending, but maybe in reality, in your particular jurisdiction, that score only reflects a 20% probability of reoffending. And so what we like to look at is how well does the tool predict versus how well does reality say that it actually is occurring. And what calibration does is say whether or not your tool is providing a meaningful predictor for your population, whether or not that person that scores a 60 is well above that person that scores a 40 on the tilt of that line. And so what we want to see is that calibration plot that I'm showing you there. I'm showing you two really poorly calibrated tools. The one on the left, you can see that orange line is not anywhere close to what we consider the perfect calibrated tool, which would be that dotted blue line as that 45-degree angle. A tool with the left figure essentially means that you're over predicting risk, meaning that your tool is telling you that there's too many people that are high risk that actually aren't that high risk. The figure on the right has the opposite problem. It's actually telling you that you've got a lot of low risk individuals that actually do have a higher risk of reoffending or committing that offense. We like to break this down so it's not just eyeballing a line and how close it is to that dotted line. You can actually get a percentage out of it that's called that calibration strength. If your line is right on that dotted line, you've got 0% difference between your line and perfect calibration. That's considered excellent, and anything 0 to 5% is considered excellent. 6 to 9 is good, 10 to 13 is fair, and anything above 13 is considered a poorly calibrated tool for your particular jurisdiction. One of the other things that we like to look at is bias and overclassification. So if you have a tool and it's predicting well, but it's only predicting well for one group within your population, let's say it predicts really well for males, but not so well for females, it might indicate that your tool has some bias within it, meaning that the scoring is working well or better for one population than it is for another. In this particular figure, I've got that risk score that ranges from 0 to 100 again, and you can see the prediction line for males and females on two different colors there. But you can see a gap between them, which really is pushing more females into that higher risk category. So let's say we set a high risk cut point that said that anybody that scored above 50 is considered high risk. Well, a female that scores 65 would be considered high risk, but their recidivism rate is roughly 45%, where a male who scores a 40 has a recidivism rate of exactly 45% as well, but wouldn't be identified as high risk. By doing this, we can see that there might be some sort of what's called intercept bias, which means that you're overclassifying females into a high risk group, and they don't really deserve to be in that high risk group. And so tools that are sort of unequally balanced across groups have bias and tend to reflect this overclassification. This overclassification can look a little different depending on how the tool is operating as well. This is a different way of looking at bias or overclassification that's called slope bias. And you can see that in the lower end of the risk score, right around 0 to 5, there's not a lot of difference between the groups. But as the risk score gets larger, the gap sort of expands between those groups. And that's essentially saying that the further you get into that high risk category, the bigger the bias that you're creating between your two groups. And so we do look for those things as well. And I'm going to show you that within your tool as we get there. Really, the last thing that we look at is the risk levels. So every tool, whatever range it has, it's typically broken up into at least 3 levels: low, mod, or medium, and high risk. What we like to see is as we compare our groups within that low category, within that moderate, and within that high risk category, that the height of the bars is relatively the same across the groups. That means that the tool's not predicting differently in terms of, in this case, failure to appear for any one of those groups, meaning that not one group has a higher rate of FTA if they're classified as low, moderate, or high. And so this tool in particular, even though the bars aren't exactly the same, the bars are pretty close to one another, indicating that there's not a lot of bias within the tool. The other thing that we like to look at, which is really important, is whether or not we have what's called a stair-step effect. So do the low bars, are they all lower than the moderate bars? Are all the moderate bars lower than the high bars? And so as you can go from low to moderate to high, it sort of steps up like a stair. And that indicates that your tool is predicting well at each level. That at each level, you have an increasing rate of whatever outcome you're looking at. Again, in this case, it's FTAs. If anybody has any questions so far, just go ahead and shout them out. I know this is a lot of background, but I'm hoping it's going to be helpful once we get there. So when tools fail or when we start to see
Hamilton?
issues sorry, was someone say something?
Yeah, could I interject a question?
Sure.
I think you mentioned that the rankings, low, moderate, and high, were divided sometimes with an eye toward available resources.
Correct.
In what I've seen, there is no guideline for where you draw those lines, and in an ideal world, it seems to me, you would have the data drive the resources. That would tell you what resources you need for high risk people, for instance. But in fact, as probably all of us know, in the real world, the resources drive the category. So there's really room for jury rigging this kind of grouping. And would you address that, please?
Sure, absolutely. So within a scientific or an empirical mindset, there is no specific method for drawing those lines. There's no reason to say that, if I had a scoring range of 0 to 100, that if I put my line at 50 versus 51, it's going to be a better optimization of that tool for your particular population. So in a sense, there is a little bit of arbitrariness to it. That being said, you can, and we do, when I develop tools, try to make those categories relatively distinct in terms of the outcomes that they predict. So you would generally like your low risk group to have maybe half or less the rate of the outcome, in this case FTAs, than the moderate risk group. And you would like your high risk group to have maybe 50% more of the outcome than you would like your high risk group to have maybe 50% more of your outcome than your moderate risk group. And you can do that, but still sort of keep your eye on two balls at the same time, where you can maybe make it so that those cut points are divided so that you do see distinctions between those groups, but you don't necessarily upset the apple cart in terms of putting way too many individuals in that high risk group that you don't have room for in terms of detention, or way too many people in, say, the moderate risk group that you just don't have the ability to supervise within the community. So you can do both at the same time, but there's no hard and fast rule about where those lines are created or divided. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It seems to me that it also suggests that a lot of this is tweaking after the fact. I mean, you're gonna make groups, you're gonna watch the outcomes, you're gonna adjust. So it's never a fixed thing, if I'm understanding you.
That is correct. Ideally, you would have individuals come in and readjust and create, different versions of the tool over time that may just slightly adjust cut points, or they may do something more dramatic to the underlying items that you're using within your tool. But yeah, keeping an eye on how well it's working and how well it's fitting your jurisdiction's needs is definitely an important part of this practice. I hope that answered everything, even though it might not have been as satisfying of a response as you wanted. Okay, in terms of when tools don't do as well or when they typically fail, there's usually 4 boxes that things fall into. So if there's a lot of subject matter expertise or decision making that goes on to how you score the tool, there can be issues with regards to your data and your culture in terms of the reliability of how those items are scored. If your tool is fully automated, then reliability really isn't an issue. But if it is, it can really demonstrate that training is an issue or people have drifted away from how the tool is supposed to be used. If your tool itself, your risk needs assessment tool, is not directing policy to where all low risk people are recommended for something, all moderate are recommended for something else, and high risk something else, then people just don't see the utility of it. And over time, they might drift away from doing it correctly. There can also be inherent bias within your tools. So a lot of times tools that are built primarily or mostly with criminal history indicators, oftentimes will see greater amounts of bias within their tool related to inherent biases within the criminal justice system. There's also an issue of factors that are not measured. A tool is only as good as what goes into it and what items are collected. And certainly there's going to be items that are not known or collected as part of that tool that maybe a judge, a guardian, or an officer would have knowledge of, and that limited item content might affect how often people use that tool as a reference. The last one is one that I'm going to point to a little bit more, is if your tool is not designed for your specific population. So if a tool is developed for a different population or designed somewhere else and then applied to your population, it could substantially differ in terms of its accuracy for your particular population. And so I'll dive down into that last part just a little bit further. Here's that AUC chart one more time, just as a reference. But on the right, these are two post-conviction assessment tools, and this is a study that was put together a couple of years ago. But essentially, two of the most prominent tools that are out there, one is called the Level of Service Inventory, and the other one is called the Ohio Risk Assessment System. The LSI was developed in Ontario, Canada, before it expanded to all of Canada and then into the United States. The ORAS was developed in Ohio and then applied in Texas and then in Indiana. What you can see there are 3 points on that figure in which that development sample, the AUC, was much higher than any of the additional applications in which that tool was provided. And what's been found is that jurisdictions and those original populations differ from the ones in which the tool is being applied to. There's countless reasons as to how they differ and why, but because of those differences, what you see is typically predictive shrinkage, in that tool does not perform as well in an alternate location as it does in the original location. And that predictive shrinkage is a pretty consistent finding across this sort of field of research. Okay, so that's all background. Hopefully that wasn't too much, and I'm happy to refresh if you didn't catch anything. But now I'm going to provide you really the evaluation and what we did for your evaluation of the PSA in Whatcom County. Give you a little bit of background on the PSA. It was the public safety assessment. It was originally developed in 2013. They utilized a large sample in Kentucky. A lot of the research and the evaluation and the tool now is provided through a nonprofit organization called Arnold Ventures. There's 9 items that are scored across several different scoring models. So 3 different outcomes are predicted in which the same items score a little bit differently, or some items score in some models and some items don't score in another. But essentially the 3 outcomes that are being predicted, one is failure to appear for a hearing or your trial. The other is a new criminal action. So a person is released into the community and then picks up a new charge or conviction. An individual is released to the community and specifically picks up a new violent charge while they're in the community. There have been prior Washington State evaluations on the PSA, both in Thurston and in Pierce County. Both of those analyses found weak to moderate predictive accuracy of the PSA, but both of them were conducted on an anticipated population. And so I put anticipated there in quotes to let you know that their assessments were essentially applying the tool to historical samples, not conducting an assessment after the PSA had been conducted and then following those individuals that had been assessed. So it's really their assessment was really what they anticipated to find, not the actual what the tool did actually find after it was implemented. Small bone of contention there. But they also found small to modest levels of bias that were indicated within the tool in both of those evaluations. In 2019, the PSA was implemented in Whatcom County, and our study started there. It started January 2019 through following a sample through March of 2025. That was a total of 3,551 defendants that had PSA scores. They also had their demographics recorded, and all of these individuals were released into the community so that we could see their outcomes upon release. We paired this data with data that we gathered directly from the Washington State Administrative Office of the Courts, or the AOC, in which they provided information on the outcomes, in particular FTAs, or missing a hearing or a trial, an NCA or a new criminal action, and a new violent criminal action after release. As you can imagine, individuals that are released to the community have different durations in which that pretrial occurs. Some are out for a day or a couple weeks, some are out for much longer. So the time to disposition is going to vary from individual to individual. We try to account for those distinctions or put everybody on an equal playing field by including what's called an offset to account for that duration of time that they were in the community within our results. So that's the background of how we did the study. In terms of results, I'm going to start with failure to appear, and these are the discrimination results, or the AUCs. What you're seeing there is a table of all of the AUCs and then a breakdown of those line charts that I demonstrated before. The one on the left is comparing males and females, and the one on the right is comparing race and ethnicity of particular groups. You can see the ranges of risk scores there at the bottom of those figures, as well as the probability of an FTA along that vertical axis. Going to the table, what we see is for FTAs, you have moderate predictive discrimination. In that total box, you see 6.8. That's above that acceptable level of 6.4. And really, almost all of the different breakdowns across male, female, white, black, Hispanic, and white, black, and Hispanic are all above that level as well in that moderate predictive discrimination level. Unfortunately, two groups, Native American or American Indian and the other category, fell below that moderate level into the weak predictive discrimination. You can see within the chart on the right as well, the two lines, one's blue and one's green. They're both flatter, indicating that they don't have as much tilt, and they're not really demonstrating as much discrimination within the tool.
Can I
Yeah,
ask
go ahead, please.
a question? And I don't know if you know the answer, but how large is the other category? Are we really capturing accurate descriptions of folks' self-identified race? And like, are we only, or is there 25% of the people that are self-identifying into these categories and 75% are in other? Like, how big are the
The other is the smallest group. I don't have the number in my head, but it is in the report of how big that group is. Generally, in terms of order, it's individuals that were white is the largest, followed by Black, Hispanic, Native American or American Indian, and then other is below that. I believe other is less than 10%.
Were those demographics pulled from the data I gave you, or was that from AOC directly?
I think it's from AOC directly.
Okay.
I
'Cause
would have to go back and double check.
Gotcha.
where does AOC get it from?
I believe it's recorded in their administrative records, but if they didn't provide it, then I got it from Alan. I just can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, the only place I think AOC would have the data is on our case resolutions when we do.
Okay.
Isn't I think it's recorded on judgment and sentences and things like that happen within a case. That sounds right, doesn't it, Maya?
I don't know. I'm gonna look.
Okay.
Okay. I can go back and double check. It's entirely possible that Alan provided it to me, but it was many, many months ago, so I don't recall exactly right now. What you can see as well within these figures is really some gaps between those lines, and those are really initial indicators that there is some modest amounts of bias within the tool, particularly between males and females. You can see sort of that intercept gap between the tool, and then the race and ethnicity chart has sort of some lines going in every different direction, which makes it a little bit harder to detail, but I'll get into some of the details of bias here in a little bit. With regards to the calibration results, remember that dotted 45-degree angle line. That's where you want your blue line to be. Your blue line is not there. It's a little bit flatter, and it has a percentage of error that's over 33%. So we want, if our blue line's right on that dotted line, it's 0. This is really indicating poor calibration in terms of the tool being originally developed in Kentucky and now being applied in Whatcom County. What it's doing within your population is over predicting FTA risk, meaning that it's identifying people as being higher risk than they actually are. So that's what sort of that line below the dotted line means. With regards to new criminal action or the second outcome, we don't see as strong of results. Instead of being moderate, we're now falling into the weaker range of predictive accuracy. So anything below 6.4 is sort of below national standards. And what we're finding is that it's exceptionally weaker for female and Native American or American Indian populations. There's substantial bias and evidence of overclassification with this particular category as well. When you're looking at the table, that total cell indicates a value of 60, which again is below the national standard of 64. Females drop all the way down to 55, which is right on the borderline of negligible. Males and white individuals, they're right within that weaker standard. But the categories of Black and Hispanic fall well below even the negligible rate of predictive accuracy for your population. So we're definitely seeing that the NCA results are not as good as those FTA results and are dipping below definitely where we need them to be. Some of the other things I wanted to point out, you're definitely seeing a gap that sort of is wider at the lower end of the risk distribution and sort of comes together at the higher end of the distribution when you're comparing males and females. That's an indicator of bias or what's called slope bias, as I showed you before. And on the right, in terms of the orange line and the blue line that indicates individuals that are Black and the Native American and American Indian population, those are relatively flat and may even have a little bit of inversion to them, meaning that the lower risk group the lower scores have a slightly higher rate of NCA compared to those that score higher on this risk distribution. That's definitely the opposite of what you want to see. And it's really sort of difficult to explain, but we're really seeing some definite bias within the tool around this NCA outcome across race, ethnicity, as well as gender. With regards to calibration, we're kind of seeing the same thing as we did with the FTA. The line is below that dotted line. It's indicating that it's over predicting risk as well, meaning that it's identifying that your group is higher risk than it actually is. It's over classifying individuals essentially, and that line is even a little bit flatter than it was for the FTA, meaning that it's not well calibrated for your population. With regards to the NVCA, that's the new violent criminal action. Here we get sort of a mix of mostly weak, but some moderate predictive discrimination, and it's weaker here for Black and male populations. The total cell there indicates a 0.62, which is in the weak range of predictive accuracy. It's a little bit stronger for females. The rationale being that it's typically easy to predict females that are not going to commit new violent offenses. So our true negatives, meaning I think you're low risk and you don't reoffend, that's easier to do for females than it is to do for males because females just do not have a high rate of violent reoffending. So their AUC gets a little bit higher than the rest of the population, but you can see everybody else ranges between 0.6 and 0.64, which is on sort of the weaker or borderline moderate end of this distribution. You're still seeing some gaps between the lines as well. And in particular, you're seeing the gap get bigger between males and females at the higher end of the scale, meaning that males are actually being overclassified or their risk is being pushed into a higher level they're being classified as a higher level of risk on this scale than females should or higher than appropriate by comparison to females. Sorry, the words are coming slower today. In terms of the plot to your right, you're seeing some of the distinction as well. Because there's just a lower rate of violent convictions, it's hard to really pull out details of the race and ethnicity distinctions because there's just not a lot to predict because there's such a low rate of violent new criminal actions when an individual is released during that pretrial period. In
Can I
terms of
ask a
the,
question?
yes, please.
Are you counting new violent criminal activity only when there's a conviction for a new charge, or are you counting charges?
Charges. Yep. That was the definition that we were given. Okay. In terms of your calibration results, we're seeing some of the similar stuff before. It's an even flatter line, meaning that it's over predicting risk, identifying that your population is much riskier for new violent criminal actions than it actually is. This is just really indicating that the tool is not as well calibrated for your population as it was for the original development population that it was created with. Okay, last, what we did was we looked at your risk levels. The way that the PSA works is that it creates this decision matrix. Every jurisdiction has its own decision matrix that's really a derivative of the original one that was created, but you're able to make some adjustments to it along the way. And essentially what it does is it combines the two primary scoring models. One of them is the FTA model and the other one is the NCA model. You can see in the rows, that's your FTA scores going from FTA 1 down to FTA 6. In terms of the columns, that's NCA 1 going all the way to NCA 6. And so what the matrix does is it identifies if somebody's low on NCA and low on FTA, they get classified as low overall. But any other combination that exists in the middle, it becomes sort of this gray area that this decision matrix is trying to outline whether or not you are low or are medium, or are you high or are you medium, when there's sort of a mix of the combination of the different categories. So how that works, all goes in and then everybody gets sort of one level or classification. We've provided, what I've provided here is sort of a breakdown first of just your population percentages that fall into each one of the categories. Your greatest population is your low risk population. That's typically what happens when a PSA is applied in a given jurisdiction, is that most people identify as low risk. So you got about 50% of your population that identify as low risk. Within males and females, there's not a lot of distinction between it, 52 versus 50. As you go from low to medium and high, medium and high are pretty close to one another. They're about 25%. High is a little bit less than medium, but roughly those bars between males and females, you're seeing a pretty equal percentage, which is decently good or a good indicator. When you're looking at race and ethnicity, there tends to be a fair amount more movement around. In particular, if you look at the high-risk population, the group that is identified as high risk more often is your Native American or your American Indian population. It's at 28%. It's not too much higher from, say, your white or your black population in terms of percentages that would definitely, raise a red flag. It is a little bit concerning that it tends to be the higher risk population, and alternatively, on the low risk population, the Native American and American Indian population is on the lower rate there as well. These are generally just the percentages of how they fall. They don't necessarily need to be equal across groups, but we like them to be relatively equal across groups, which indicates that the tool has some equity to it in terms of the way it's being classified. So that's just who falls into what category. Now I'm going to show you differences by outcome. So in terms of your FTA and your NCA, looking across different gender groups, FTA is on the left, NCA are the bar charts on the right. What we see is that as you go from low to medium to high, those rates of FTA start out at 39% when you're comparing males and females on FTA, and then they drop to 21 and 20, and then they go up to 49 and 48, meaning that you're not seeing the stair-step effect that you typically want to see, where the low-risk population commits the least amount of FTAs, medium commits the middle amount, and then the high risk commits the highest amount. You're not seeing that, and it's a little bit of what's called inversion within your medium category there for FTA. Within NCA, it's a little bit of a different story, but essentially what you're seeing is that the three categories don't predict very well for any one of those groups. While the high risk category is slightly higher in terms of its comparison to medium or low risk groups, whether or not you're looking at males or females, there's not a lot of distinction between those groups. So low versus medium, it's almost exactly the same in terms of its prediction, and then high is just a little bit higher than your low and medium. So that stair step effect is really lacking here. Not seeing a lot of bias in terms of the groups bars being all that different from one another. They're within, say, 10% of each other, which is typically considered acceptable or okay. But the sort of the lack of discrimination or distinction between those groups is what's more problematic. By race, it gets a little more convoluted because there's a lot more bars, but you can sort of see the same pattern as well. On the left is your FTA rates. On the right is your NCA rates. What you can see is that your low risk population and your medium risk population commit about the same rates of FTAs, and then your high risk population commits a bit more. The Native American population in particular, those individuals identified as low, commit substantially more FTAs by comparison to the rest of the low risk population, meaning that the tool is not doing a very equivalent job across those populations. But really, again, the main finding between FTAs and the NCAs is really that lack of a stair-step effect that's going on. You're not really seeing a distinction in terms of a prediction of low, moderate, medium, and high risk, where you don't see that the low risk population has the fewest amount, followed by medium, and then eventually high has the most. All of those bars are relatively similar to one another. And so identifying bias without a stair-step effect is kind of difficult. And really that's sort of the main finding to take home, is just that the combining of that decision matrix is really sort of muddying the waters a little bit by combining both NCA and FTA predictions into one decision matrix model, that you're really not getting a lot of prediction when you merge those two things together. So just to give you sort of a wrap up of conclusions with regards to the PSA, this is the first prospective, robust evaluation of the tool within Washington State, although there's been a couple before. Those were sort of backward-looking, anticipated findings. What we find is weak to moderate predictive discrimination, which is similar to what Pierce and Thurston had found as well. But going beyond those prior results, what we find is that the tool is poorly calibrated for the Whatcom population. It's over predicting risk in all three types of outcomes. And there's some notable biases that we're seeing, particularly with regards to those NCAs, in which we're seeing definite group biases that we saw on those line charts that I demonstrated before. The risk levels also, they really have that lack of predictive stair-step effect. And I believe that that's really the result of trying to merge or combine FTA and NCA risk together. And they're sort of fighting one another and not coming out with a clear pattern of prediction. So there's some likely issues to why we're seeing sort of these less than optimal results. One is predictive shrinkage. I mentioned that the tool was built in Kentucky. It's likely that the frequency of the types of FTAs and NCAs and NBCAs that you're looking at differ substantially between Kentucky and Whatcom County. There's demographic differences. There's all sorts of revised Code of Washington differences that could be impacting how that tool is just not designed for your population, and so you're seeing less than optimal results. Again, that decision matrix, it's not really achieving its intent by trying to combine those two models together. And I think merging those two models really muddies the water and reduces the accuracy that is present within the tool. In terms of recommendations, I've put these in the report, but I'll go through them briefly here. We would recommend that you recalibrate your tool. This would mean that each one of those items has values that's associated with it. And those cut points that are set to identify low, moderate, and high, those can be readjusted and can get a little bit closer to the Whatcom population, utilizing some statistical modeling and identifying how you might sort of re-engineer the tool to better fit your population. So if the intent is to reduce detention and your tool is over predicting, you can ratchet that back so that it's more optimal and more optimally designed for your population's rate of FTAs and NCAs and the rate of the prior offenses that they have as well. I would consider, if you're thinking about maybe adopting a different tool or adding to the tool that you have, that you would consider non-criminal history items. There's lots of needs items that are typically collected as part of pretrial, things about whether or not somebody has stability in their employment or their residency or their family life. These items tend to have less bias within them because they're less linked to criminal history indicators. One of the tools that I was part of the development team with King County is that they developed their PRINS tool, in which they collected they collect dynamic items from individuals as they're being held pre-trial, right before that detention hearing. And a lot of what goes into that tool is more dynamic in nature, although they still have criminal history indicators as well. I would definitely recommend some sort of redesign to your decision matrix. Maybe instead of merging the two together, create some sort of hierarchical classification. So if somebody's high risk in one of your scales, they're identified as high risk. If they're moderate in one of your scales but low in another, call them moderate. That way there's no distinction or there's no breaking apart sort of or muddying the water of what is their actual risk. Are they high risk for FTA? Are they high risk for NCA? Or are they high risk for both? That's really the distinction that I think is really clouding what that decision matrix is trying to provide. Okay, that was a lot. That's all of my slides, but I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you might have about some of the findings and go into greater detail if you want them. Do I just go ahead and
Yeah, I'll jump in.
go ahead?
So many questions, yank on the rope when I reach a
Okay.
maximum. One of the things that I've always been concerned about in the risk assessments is that a lot of this could correlate to poverty as well as race and gender, and that doesn't seem to be factored in here. It's exacerbated by the fact, and I don't know what account you were able to take of this, Dr. Hamilton, but at least until relatively recently, most judicial officers insisted on imposing bail in addition to release conditions. And so I don't know how all that plays together in the confounding factors that you found. So I appreciate your addressing those. My second question is, we adopted the PSA that had FTA and NCA and VCA all combined together, and I think Alan was even trained on that. So it's interesting to me that you're talking about splitting those out. Maybe that's a development in the field. Also, we adopted it because Yakima had done a validation study that showed very little discrimination for their population, and our pre-implementation assessment seemed to confirm that that would be the case here too. So I don't know what went awry there, and I don't know why you didn't refer to the Yakima evaluation.
I apologize for not referring to the Yakima evaluation when I was creating the background. There was a mention of the Yakima study, but we just weren't able to dig that one up. Maybe someone could provide it to us, and we could definitely add it to the literature as well, so that we could provide those results. I'd be happy to dig into it. I know that it exists. I just haven't had a chance to incorporate it into what we've done. I'm losing track of your first question, though.
The first question was the influence that financial status and the imposition of bail on top of as a part of release conditions. Somebody may have recommended release under certain conditions, but if you couldn't make the bail that went with it, you're ending up in jail, even though you might have been, releasable.
Is that a practice that occurs currently?
Yes. It's not like policy driven or anything, but occasionally judicial officers will decide a constellation of release conditions that include bail, and then to the extent bail is posted, supervision, pretrial services, and there's an associated risk factors in there. So
Yeah.
that does happen.
Unfortunately, with the data that we had or were provided, we couldn't get into what the actual conditions were of the release. It was just about how well the tool performed. There definitely is some, although it's very, very scarce research about identifying what somebody gets in terms of release conditions or how they're released, and how that interacts with their risk level. Although a lot of that is just really early on, sort of speculation as to how best to analyze that. So it's kind of hard to say, if somebody is identified as medium risk and they're given additional conditions, does that really suppress their likelihood of committing an FTA, or does that suppress their likelihood of committing an NCA? That is just not part of the landscape of what's out there in terms of research or even how we could conduct this analysis. So you're right that it could be a confounding factor. It might be the reason that we see, slightly lower rates of FTAs for the moderate risk group by comparison to the low risk group. But it's difficult to tell with the analyses and the data that we had.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, so when we're talking about native also, because that showed a high level of bias, when using this tool, we don't have access to federal records. We don't have access to, we can get NCIC, which is the national criminal information, but I don't believe they show any federal records of people who have tribal charges. Would that affect the predictability?
It could, for sure. There has been some studies done examining the distinction because most studies within the United States typically are done with sort of a state's administrative office of the courts. And so that's what we're pulling from. So if somebody, say, was released pretrial in Whatcom and then they went across state lines to Oregon and committed an offense, that wouldn't be collected within our data. So the same thing is what you're describing is if somebody commits an offense on tribal lands, is that's probably not going to make its way into our data as well. There hasn't been a lot of studies out there as to how much impact that has, but the ones that are out there really says that trying to gather every single source rather than just the primary source doesn't provide you all that much accuracy up and over beyond what you're getting from your state source. I hope that answers your question, but maybe I missed part of what you were trying to say.
No, that does.
Okay.
And so going back to the recap, so ours is showing less predictability on individuals who commit new crimes, right? That's kind of the biggest bias right now.
Correct.
And maybe this is a question for a smaller group or just with management, but so right now it was common practice to use what's called an auto override. So if they have a violent offense, sometimes they'll bump up on the matrix. And if you're using the data from the matrix and it automatically showing them with a high versus a medium, that would also, just by the use of the tool itself, would be promoting the bias that would be easily adjustable.
Yeah, we didn't look at any overrides that you had. It was just how the tool was scoring somebody in a particular category. So it was a sort of as pure as we could get evaluation of the tool itself and its score and what decision it was providing. Not any adjustments that you all made on the other side of the scale.
Okay.
Back when we first looked at this, Dr. Hamilton, we saw that some places use static factors and some places use dynamic and some use both. And just as an example of resources driving the construction of the tool, we thought it was quicker and less expensive, less staff time, and didn't seem to be that different in accuracy to rely on static factors. But I think I was hearing you saying those dynamic factors could be more predictive, more accurate.
Well, they definitely add to your ability to predict, and they tend to have less bias within them. So anytime you're able to gather stuff that is proven to be predictive of your outcomes, you want to add it. But typically, what we've seen in doing this across many states and across other researchers that aren't me as well, is that tools that incorporate more dynamic needs assessment items are have less inherent bias within them because they're not wrapped within those biases that are contained within sort of law enforcement strategies, potential issues of discrimination, or differential enforcement.
So we didn't understand that at the time, but it sounds like maybe that's becoming a best practice to incorporate dynamic factors.
It is. I don't think that it was maybe something that you thought of at the time, because at the time there wasn't a lot of pretrial risk assessments out there, and most of them that were created, I mentioned, the other two that are primary, they both use static factors as well. So as far as the landscape of pretrial tools that you could select from that were already created, I wouldn't say that it was a fault on your behalf of picking the wrong one. It's that the landscape is really built around making quick administrative data decisions rather than trying to identify sort of the totality of risks that person has on pretrial release, which would take an interview, and it takes a little bit more time to gather those dynamic items than it does the criminal history ones, which obviously has a cost that goes with it as well.
I have to interject, I'm sorry, because I
Sure.
have another meeting I have to leave for, but obviously I think this is going to generate a lot of discussion. It certainly makes me very concerned about our continued use of this tool today, this afternoon, tomorrow. I don't think we meet monthly anymore. I'm sorry, I don't really remember, but I guess I don't know who's going to make decisions based on this report and how those decisions will be reported back to this group or the IPRTF in general. And I guess I need some procedural, I need to get off this meeting, but I also need to know, like, what are the next steps?
I have to go to a 1:30 court calendar, but I think what needs to happen immediately is a quickly arranged, a quicker arranged meeting of this group to be able to just talk amongst ourselves about some of what we heard today and talk about what to do next and why we should do it. So that's what I think.
Would you like me to schedule a meeting for Friday, March 6th at this time or sooner?
March 6th is our next meeting.
The next meeting is in April,
Oh,
but we can schedule a special meeting on March 6th if you like.
that sounds like a good idea to me. Does everybody agree with that? Anybody opposed to that?
No, that works.
Okay, then I'll work with Jill to schedule, or with Valerie's help probably, to schedule that and reach out to everybody.
I'm not sure if I'll be here that day, but I don't know what else I can do about that.
Okay.
I'll try. Okay, thanks.
We can
All
pick another time if that's what everyone prefers as well.
Okay,
Where
I do
can-
have to. I'm getting called out to
You
court.
go.
I have to go. But
Yeah.
Dr. Hamilton, thank you for your presentation. I think it's really important for us to kind of confront and do something about. So I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I also don't want to drop a grenade and leave. So if you all need help afterwards, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to do what I can.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Judge.
Dr.
Jill here. I can close out the meeting. It looks like people are ending. Dr. Hamilton, are you able to share your presentation?
Absolutely, I can
Want to
email
email
that.
it to me, and
Mhm.
awesome. Thank you. And I'll just state for the record, even though many people are gone, there are no attendees today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure if we had emailed before, if you have my email address. Nixon. I can send it to you right quick. I'll just send you an email right
Okay.
now. How's that
Sounds
sound?
good.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Have a great
Have a good
day.
day.